Good day, students. This is the biology class, and the topic is nervous coordination. We'll have it in two parts. So let's start off with the first part. Okay, so nervous system, like every other system in the body, has to do with coordinating some major parts of the body, like activities that has to do with the functioning of organ, the way the hormone is being secreted, then even contraction and extraction of muscle. All those things takes place in orderly manner. One activity triggers another one, and that brings about an overall effect to the benefit of the animal as a whole. So that coordination is the major function of the nervous system. However, the nervous system and the endocrine system work hand in hand to achieve that coordination. So the hypothalamus is the important link between these two systems. Thank God in our previous presentation we discussed endocrine system, and you will see that we mentioned the function of the hypothalamus serving as a link between these two important systems that perform the function of coordination in the body. Now, the nervous system as it is, the smallest structural unit of the nervous system is called the nerve cell, and it can also be called a neuron. The neuron, like the cell of every other system, has a body cell and a protoplasmic process. That protoplasmic process can also be called nerve fibres. That fibers, they are tied together in bundles, and they can be regarded as the nerves. The cell has a nucleus, and it is surrounded by the cytoplasm. The nucleus acts as the brain of the cell. To understand this nervous system better, we will categorize it into two main parts. So this first part of the nervous system, we talk about the first part, which is the central nervous system, and the other parts, which will be in our later presentation, will be on the peripheral nervous system. So coordination by the nervous system is done by these two major parts. So let's take them one after the other. Central nervous system. The central nervous system is a control center that controls the major activity of the nervous system. It is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain as it is, you know that these two key parts, the brain and the spinal cord, is only found in the vertebrates. The vertebrates, they are the animals that have backbone. So when they are just developing, it just forms like a hollow tube, a narrow tube. And as the organism is developing, it enlarges at the frontal parts to form the brain, and the rest form the spinal cord. So this is what we have. This is what we call the central nervous system. The brain, this is the brain here, then this is the spinal cord. But in the body, the brain is housed in the skull, the cranium part. The cranium is the part of the bone that covers the brain. Then the spinal cord too is also enclosed in vertebral column. We will take this one after the other for better understanding. The brain now. For us to understand better, I want us to follow these enlargements, three major enlargements. You have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Bear in mind these three main parts. Now, this is the forebrain. This is the brain of the vertebrates. This is the forebrain. Then this is the hindbrain, and the rest is the hindbrain. So let's start with the forebrain. The forebrain consists of the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. This is the location of the thalamus, and this is the location of the hypothalamus. Now, the cerebrum itself is the largest portion of the brain, and it is made up of two halves, the right and the left cerebral hemisphere. This is the left hemisphere, this side, and this other side is the right hemisphere. In fact, The cerebrum takes the larger part of the brain. It's the largest part that I have said. Now, this hemisphere is separated by what we call corpus callosum. Now, that corpus callosum is in between the two cerebral hemispheres, and it gives information. It keeps them in touch. It's aware. It keeps the right hemisphere aware of what is happening in the left hemisphere. So the cerebrum can also be divided into 4 distinct lobes. Now we have the frontal lobe, which is in front. It is colored red here. This is the frontal lobe. The major function of that is problem solving, emotional traits, reasoning, making judgments, speaking, voluntary motor, and other activities. Now the parental lobe is colored yellow. Look at it here, this side of the brain. It has to do with knowing the right from the left. That is knowing the right thing from the bad thing. Then sensitization, reading, and body orientation. The temporal lobe, which is the next one, is colored in blue. And the major function has to do with understanding language, behavior, the way we behave, being able to keep memory of some things, and even hearing. The last part, which is the occipital lobe, is colored in green, and it has to do with the vision and color perception. So this is the main function of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is a major part of the brain. You can see that the lobes anchor different areas of life. Now, the thalamus is another part of the forebrain. It's like 2 round objects. The singular is thalamus and the plural is thalami. So they are located at the back of the cerebrum. And their major function is that they act as relay centers for receiving and transmitting sensory informations to relevant parts of the cerebral cortex. Then they also transmit outgoing motor impulses from the cerebral cortex. As we go on, you understand the motor impulses and the sensory information. Now, the hypothalamus, we have also talked about it in our previous presentation. It is located below the thalami, and it controls autonomic nervous system. It plays a major role in homeostatic by regulating temperature and some of the secretions by the endocrine. It can also help in the feeling of hunger and thirst. There's a way the body sends, the signal sends, the hypothalamus sends a signal for the body to perceive hunger and thirst. Then it also plays a major part in influencing emotion, like the way we feel pain, anger, pleasure, happiness, and all that. So the hypothalamus controls that function. So far we have talked about the cerebrum as part of the forebrain. Then we talk about the thalamus and hypothalamus. They are both part of the forebrain. Now, the midbrain is like the middle piece between the forebrain and the hindbrain. And the specific function is that it controls reflexes of sight and hearing. Bear in mind that is a major function of the midbrain. It controls reflexes of sight and hearing. Though it is associated with movement of head during focusing and dictation of sound. Sometimes when you want to focus on something, you adjust your head. That might not be a voluntary action, but for the proper focusing, the brain adjusts the head. The same with the ear too. So those are the function of the midbrain. The hindbrain, which is the last part behind the cerebrum, coordinates involuntary action, and it is composed of the cerebellum, the pons varoli, and the medulla oblongata. What do I mean by involuntary actions or involuntary activities? We will still talk about it more in our next presentation. But it has to do with activities that are not at will, that is not done at will. So The part of the hindbrain include the cerebellum. The cerebellum has to do with movement of muscular muscles. It controls muscular movements and entire body posture for balance. So when we are talking about body posture, we are talking about balance, we talk about the cerebellum. That part of the brain controls that major function. Then the pons varoli is like a nerve fiber that connect the lateral of the cerebellum ventrally. Then the medulla oblongata, it joins the spinal cord to the brain. The spinal cord connects to the brain through the medulla oblongata. In fact, the hindbrain sometimes can be regarded as the brain stem. But the major function of the medulla oblongata is that it controls involuntary movements like respiration, digestion, heartbeats, and blood pressure. So let's examine the spinal cord. We said that the central nervous system is categorized into the brain and the spinal cord. So, like we talked about the brain being housed in the skull, covered by the cranium. The spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. Most people sometimes take the vertebral column as the spinal cord. The vertebral column, they are just series of bones that are arranged in an orderly manner. So the spinal cord is in the middle of those bones. Those bones include the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral, and the coccygeal. So those bones are arranged in such a way to permit the flow of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is just like a fluid that surrounds the nerves. It extends from the brain, and the medulla oblongata, which is the part of the hindbrain, connect to the spinal cord. So both the brain and the spinal cord, they are enveloped by three membranes. Those membranes are called the meninges. And when you have infection of the cerebrospinal fluid, we call the disease meningitis. Anything that happens to the membrane that covers the spinal cord and the brain, we call it meningitis. Then the function of the spinal cord is that it coordinates simple reflex actions and autonomic reflexes. It coordinates simple reflex actions. Then it also receives and transmits electrical signals throughout the entire body and back then to the brain. So you will see that you will see nerves around the spinal cord. Those nerves spread around the body to form the peripheral nervous system. So it takes information to the brain and information from the brain back to the body. Now, let's quickly have a quick recap on what we've done. We've talked about central nervous system as a major part of the nervous system. We said it includes the brain and the spinal cord. We were able to talk about the different parts of the brain, the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Then the function of those different parts. So we also talk about the spinal cord as the link between the brain and the body. So I want you to answer these questions, and I want you to subscribe to this YouTube channel without any cost. Then also click the like button. Thank you so much for listening. Good day, Scholar students. This is Scholar's Universal Online class. So in our previous class, which is Nervous System Part 1, we talked about central nervous system as part of the nervous system. So we talked extensively about the brain and the spinal cord. This is the second part, and we will major on the peripheral nervous system. Now, this chart is like a summary of what we've done in this nervous system and what we are going to do. You'll see that the nervous system is divided into central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the part 1 of this class, we talked about the brain and the spinal cord. So here now, we are going to talk about how the peripheral nervous system is divided into sensory pathway and the motor pathways. The motor pathway is divided into somatic, which we call the voluntary nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into parasympathetic division and sympathetic division. So this is what we want to consider in this presentation. The peripheral nervous system is the functional link between the environment and the nervous system that makes up the sensory system, and as well as the functional link between the central nervous system and the effectors that make up the motor system. So here, now that we are talking about peripheral nervous system, we will talk about the sensory system and the motor system. The sensory system itself is composed of sensory receptors. The sensory receptors, they are in sense organs, which are located in every part of the body. And they are also called the afferent neurons. They are connected to the receptors and they carry information from the receptors to the central nervous system. So the afferent is such that it works in an inward manner, takes signal from either the internal organ or the external organ from the receptors to the brain. The motor system, on the other hand, it consists of the effector neurons. And what it does is that it collects information from the brain to the body. So it's an outward movement. It works in an outward manner. So these two work together as the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, they are just nerves that spread around the body and transmit information. This image shows the peripheral nervous system. Look at nerves spreading around the body. Some emerge from the nerves, from the brain. You call them cranial nerves. Some from the nerves, some from the spinal cord, you call them spinal nerves. So, and all these around the body, so that whatever happens at any part of the body, the brain can have the signal, and whatever decision the brain makes will be taken back to the body. So this is how the peripheral system works. Of course, the peripheral nervous system works hand in hand with the central nervous system to give the function of coordination. Now, the sensory and the motor system, they emerge from the central nervous system as cranial nerves or spinal nerves. I've told us that nerves that emerge from the brain, they are called the cranial nerves. And we have examples like the optic nerves from the retinal of the eyes. Of course, it is the eyes that focuses on something, but the brain interprets the message and send it back to the eyes. That is why we will be able to see that, okay, this is red, this is color blue. So that nerves that transmit the message is called optic nerves. Another nerves that emerge from the cranial nerves is the auditory nerves, and they are from the cochlear and the semicircular canal of the ear. The cochlear is the part of the hair that has to do with hearing, and the semicircular canal gives balance. Those are the two major functions of the hair. So they are connected to the auditory nerves, and they emerge from the brain so that they will be able to interpret whatever we hear or whatever need that has to do with balancing. Now, the olfactory nerves is also a cranial nerve, and it is from the olfactory organ in the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is embedded in our nose. So that helps us to interpret the chemoreceptors. The brain picks, when the sensory organs, the sensory motor pick up the chemoreceptors, maybe the smell is jollof rice or it is fried rice, the brain will be able to interpret it and say, oh, this is rice now. Can't you see? It's not vegetable they are cooking, no, Jerry. You understand that? So that has to do with the function of the olfactory nerves that connect whatever receptors the nose perceives to the brain. So the motor system, on the other hand, they are part of the cranial nerves and spinal nerves, and they consist of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So we shall take this one after the other. The somatic nervous system is like a nervous network that is concerned with the movement of the parts of the body that contain the skeleton. So when we hear somatic nervous system, we're talking about voluntary. And I said it is the movement of the parts of the body that contain skeleton. So it is made up of the motor neurons, which connect and controls nervous system with the skeletal muscles. Then these motor neurons are part of the cranial and the spinal nerves, with their cell body and in the central nervous system as fibers extending to all the way to the muscle of the limbs and to the digits. So there's a way the motor neurons connect the cranial nerves to the central nervous system and extend to the muscles of the limbs and the digits. Now, the impulses which move along these fibers bring about appropriate movements, and those movements, mostly, they are voluntary movements. Voluntary means movement at will. The autonomic, on the other hand, can be grouped into two parts: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is a very crucial part of the brain, and it has to do with flight response to danger, either to defend oneself or to escape. So you see that the body moves in case there's a sudden feeling somewhere, or there's a sudden noise somewhere. The body moves in a way, not a voluntary movement this time around, even though it has to do with skeletal movements, but it is involuntary movement. The body quickly adjusts, the brain adjusts the body to move in response to defend oneself or to escape from danger. Then the parasympathetic nervous system will balance whatever happens in the parasympathetic nervous system, the synthetic rather. So the parasympathetic will bring about balancing. It will normal the effects of whatever has happened during the synthetic nervous system. So the autonomic connect to the central nervous system. It connect the central nervous system with glands, smooth and cardiac muscle. Of course, when we talk about the smooth muscle, we're talking about the muscles of the organs of the body, like the muscles of the kidney, the muscles of the liver, or the muscles of the visceral. Then the cardiac muscle is the muscle of the heart. So that function, it connects those muscles with central nervous system, so that the central nervous system can be able to control and coordinate what happens in those organs and system. So this autonomic nervous system bring about involuntary activity. You can see now that as human being, I cannot decide what happens in my kidney. Those are involuntary activities. I cannot determine what happens in my liver. Those are involuntary activities. So those ones are observed in the internal organ, like the way the heart will pump blood, like the movements in the alimentary canal during digestion, when we take in food, the peristaltic movement along the esophagus, the movement of food from the stomach to the duodenum, all those things, they are involuntary movements, and they have to do with autonomic nervous system. Even the movement of urine from the kidney to the bladder, or from the bladder through the ureter to the outside environment, all those have to do with autonomic. They are involuntary activity, unlike the somatic that we have talked about, that has to do with voluntary movement of skeletal muscles. So we need to understand what a neuron is. I have said earlier that a neuron can also be called a nerve cell, and it is the basic structural unit of the nervous system. So that is the smallest or the structural unit of the nervous system. Then the nerves in that neuron, they are closely packed together by connective tissue. Then a mature neuron has lost its power of regeneration. The major structure of that means that the neuron do not have the ability to divide. You understand that cell cannot divide like every other cell. So as it matures, it's lost its power of regeneration. Now, if we consider the basic structure of a neuron, let's imagine a tree that is standing straight, where we have the branches, the trunk or the stem, and the roots. So that is, if we have that image in our mind, we can relate it to this structure of the nervous of the neuron. This is the cell body that extends into the dendron and the dendrites. They are like the branches of the tree. The cell body consists of the nucleus, I've said that the other time, and the protoplasmic content, the cytoplasm. The protoplasm is the content of the cell itself. Then we have the trunk, which we call the axon. So this is the axon. The axon is like the trunk of a tree, and it helps in transmitting messages. It transmits messages. The dendrons connect to another nerve cell, and whatever a message or signal is being passed will be sent across the axon. The axon is covered by the myelin sheath, which serve as insulator, and it extends into this synaptic knob. So the synaptic knob connects to another nerve cells and pass the information. It's just like we have a type of relay race whereby somebody passes on the baton to the other person. So that is what happens here. Signals or impulses are being transferred. So these are the three basic structure main points to note in the structure of the neuron: the cell body, the dendron, and the axon. Now, there are three forms of neuron. We have the sensory, which I've called the afferent. Afferent is inward movement, inward. It works in an inward manner. It receives impulses from the receptors outside or inside the body and pass it to the central nervous system. Then the motor or efferent, outward. It receives impulses from the central nervous system and pass it to the body, to the effectors that will feel it. It could be the internal organ or the external organ like the skin. So we also have the relay neurons, and these are the images of the three types of neuron. The relay neuron is just like is in between the two sensory and the motor neuron. It transfers impulses from the sensory to the motor. So it is mainly found in the central nervous system. You know, the sensory and the motor, they are both reporting to the central nervous system. So the relay neuron is embedded in the central nervous system. And these are the images. You can see that this is a sensory neuron that picks impulses from receptors to the central nervous system. This is where the cell body is located. These are the dendron that extend into the dendrites. This is the relay in the middle of the two of them, and it is found in the central nervous system. This is the motor neuron. This is where its own cell body is. This is the axon, and this is the synaptic node. So neurons can also be grouped according to the number of axons or processes. It could be unipolar. If it's unipolar, that means it has one axon. If it is bipolar, it has two axons. And if it is multipolar, it has many axons, like the ones that are being shown here. Now, all these that we have talked about will lead to action and behavior. Those responses, some things that goes on in the body, even though I cannot dictate what happens in my internal organ, but if anything goes wrong, I can feel it. So what is action? Action are response to stimuli. Stimuli is like the plural of stimulus, and they involve the neuron and the endocrine system. You know, we have said that in coordinating the activities of the body, the nervous system and the endocrine system work hand in hand. They are good best friends. They must not fight. So those things determine action. And action can be divided into two. We have the reflex actions and the voluntary actions. While I was presenting, I've mentioned the reflex actions and voluntary actions, which we will still talk about extensively. Then behavior, they are response to changes in the environment. These can be actions that are modified by the environment. It could be instinctive behavior or a learned behavior. So let's take this one after the other. I've said action could be voluntary or involuntary. When it is voluntary, that means it involves skeletal muscles, like raising your hands when you want to answer the question. Ma, can I answer the question? You decide to raise up your hand. So it's a voluntary action. You can say, I don't want to raise up my hand, and put down your hands. You understand that? So that has to do with skeletal movement, but it is at will, it is done at will. The involuntary sometimes could involve skeletal movement, and sometimes it could involve the movement of the internal organs, or the way the internal organ function, the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, the glands, the normal, like stabilizing normal blood pressure, and the rest of them. So those are involuntary actions. Now, the reflex actions that are called involuntary. Let's explain this. I have said that they are responses that are not controlled by will. They are involuntary. It is not what you decide to do. Example, sneezing, pulling a hand away from a hot object. Those are involuntary actions. There is no way you put your hand on a hot object and you will not want to remove your hand unless you are being compelled to it. So even without you knowing, you quickly take up your hand. Then sneezing, you don't wish to sneeze. You understand? So those are involuntary actions. Now, those responses, they are autonomic, and it can also be called automatic, and it occurs rapidly. Before you know it, you have sneezed. If not now that sneezing has become one major sign of a disease. It's something that people do every time here and there without any control or holding back. So those responses, they are involuntary actions. The reflex actions are mainly proactive, and they also help us to maintain equilibrium in both our internal and our external environment. So they like stabilize what happens inside and outside our environment. Examples include blinking of the eyes, nil jack, and contraction of pupil. When there's light, your eyes is suddenly exposed to a bright light. There's a way your eyes, the pupil contracts. Those are voluntary, involuntary, or reflex action. Let's look at this example of involuntary action, whereby we have a nail. Somebody step on the nail, and the moment the stimulus is being received, it is being passed through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. The spinal cord takes it to the brain interprets it and sends it back as motor neuron, and you can see the response that is being received. The response is that the person lifts the leg from the nail. So that is a reflex action. It's not what the moment you step on the nail and you feel the pain. It's just that the sending of the image, the response, and receiving the response back is very fast. That is the major difference between the nervous system and the hormonal system, which I will still want you to compare the two of them and find more differences. So it works very fast. Before you know it, you feel the pain, you remove your leg. So that is a reflex action. Now, voluntary action, on the other hand, is an action which we think about before doing them. They are actually acts of will. We decide them, and they can also be called conscious actions. They are conscious actions. So a sudden withdrawal of food from a sharp object, it's a reflex action. But when we now go back and examine and say, let me remove the sharp object, that is a voluntary action. You have decided, so let me remove it so that I will not step on it again, or somebody coming behind will not step on it. But you feeling the pain, removing your leg, it is involuntary. But you going back to pick up the sharp object is a voluntary action. Feeling thirsty is a reflex action. You don't decide to feel thirsty. Sometimes you just don't, I just finished drinking water, but I don't know what is happening. I'm thirsty again. Then when you now go to get water and drink the water, that is a voluntary action. You have decided, you are doing it yourself. It involves so many things. So voluntary action therefore involve higher centers of the brain. You will see now that it involves you deciding to do some things. Then it also involves numerous neurons that are at work. Numerous neurons, sometimes you quickly judge, should I drink water in this environment? No, I don't want water in this environment. If I ask for water now, they might decide to, okay, you don't have bottled water, I don't take any other water. You quickly decide together. So it involves numerous neurons. Then it also brings about comparatively slow response. It is not as rapid as the voluntary. So the response might be slow. You might think and say, okay, should I buy water? Let me keep my money. Let's get home. When I get home, I will soon get home in the next 1 hour, then I can drink water. Oh, let me buy the water. So it's not as quick as the involuntary action. Then it brings about responses that vary with circumstances. I've also said that the circumstance can also change whatever your response is. So the response is not static. So this is comparing voluntary with involuntary action based on nature, the speed of action, the way the responses is. And if you study this very well, you will see that I've mentioned some of the things that are on this slide. So let's now talk about behavior, which I said could be instinctive behavior or a learned behavior. When it is instinctive behavior, that means it has to do with instincts. It originates from birth. It is innate. It's not what you plan or learn over time. You are being born with it. Examples include pecking action of a newly hatched chick. When a chick is being hatched, it begins to peck to look for food. Nobody has not seen anyone doing it. It's not as if the behavior is being learned, but it's the instincts just tell the chick to do that, and it's doing it. Then sucking action of an infant. You see that once you give birth to a baby, you put the baby to breast, and immediately the child attempts to suck. Not that the child has to go to a primary school or secondary school to learn how to do that. But some behavior, they are learned behavior. And most animals start life with instinctive behavior. But with time, the behavior is being modified by experience. And the animal is said to learn from that experience. So when you learn from that experience, it becomes a learned behavior. When a reflex action is modified by experience, it can be called a conditioned reflex. It's modified, the reflex action, as now, because let's say that sneezing, because I know that sneezing is a reflex action, but because I know that if I sneeze, they will say, hey, corona, I can decide not to, I can, try to control my sneezing. As it's coming, I can hold my nose, I can do some things. So that has become a conditioned reflex. You understand that? So many examples of reflex actions and they can be consciously modified by manipulating the condition. Then the result will now become a learned behavior. With time, most of the learned activities become almost automatic. When we learn the behavior, it becomes part of us, like driving. Once you know how to drive, you don't take the key and say, okay, what should I do now? Should I move the steering? You already know what to do. So it becomes automatic. Swimming, you are inside water. You will not be saying, should I move one leg? Typing, as you learn it, it becomes automatic to practice. So far, we've talked about the peripheral nervous system, which is the other part of the central nervous system. Then we talked about neuron as the basic or structural units. We talked about 3 types of neuron. We talked about sensory, motor, and relay. We also said we can use a number of axons to classify neurons. So we talked about how those neuron activities can bring about action and behavior, either voluntary action or involuntary action. So I want you to attempt these questions. I believe you'll be able to answer them. They are simple questions prepared from the slide. Subscribe to this YouTube channel and click on the like button. Thank you for listening.